The crying came from the dark, and Sera stopped walking before her mind could stop her. Don't turn around. She knew what happened to omegas who got involved. The scars across her ribs proved it. The moonfruit felt warm in her freezing hand. 2 weeks searching for ashwood. 2 nights sleeping in snow. 1 fruit standing between her and starvation. Keep walking. That was what every cold night had taught her. What every empty morning had carved into her bones. But the crying didn't stop. It wasn't loud. It wasn't begging. It sounded like someone who already knew nobody was coming. That was what made Sera turn around. 20 feet from the road sat an old woman trembling in the snow, wrapped in a cloak too thin to survive winter. And her eyes. Gold. Not soft gold. Not candlelight. The kind that made predators step back in fear. Sera should have walked away. Instead, she stepped closer. And unknowingly changed the fate of an entire kingdom. Here is what the pack knew about Sera. She was Omega. The lowest. The forgotten one. Here is what the pack didn't know. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. The Iron Veil pack had over 200 wolves. A great hall that could seat every single one of them at long tables, with fire roaring and meat piled high, and wine that smelled like dark berries and smoke. Sera had eaten in that hall exactly twice in the last year, both times because someone needed a floor scrubbed and offered a bowl of cold broth as payment. She lived in the storage shed at the edge of the territory. Not a house. Not even a proper room. A shed. Where the spare tools were kept, and the old grain bags gathered mildew, and the wind came through the wall cracks like a living thing, looking for something to freeze. Her bed was a pile of wool sacking. Her blanket was someone else's cast-off, torn at one corner and smelling faintly of the previous owner's dog. This was not cruelty by accident. It was cruel by design. The pack's beta female, Corinne, had decided years ago that Sera was a problem. Not because Sera had done anything. Corinne simply hated weakness the way some people hate bad weather, personally, deeply, and with an energy that bordered on obsession. And Sera was weak in the only way that mattered in a wolf pack. She had no rank, no allies, no family, and no fight left in her eyes. You eat when we have leftovers, Corinne had told her once, smiling with her perfect teeth. Which means some nights you don't eat at all. That's the natural order, little Omega. Don't make it strange. So Sera didn't make it strange. She woke before dawn to haul water from the river. She cleaned the stables while the ranked wolves were still sleeping off their feasts. She mended clothing, prepared storage, salted meat, repaired fences, work that kept the pack running, work that no one ever acknowledged, work that disappeared the moment it was done because the people who needed it never wanted to think too hard about who was doing it. And when the moon rose and the pack gathered to howl together, that ancient ritual of belonging, of we are one, we are here, we are pack, Sera stood at the edge of the tree line and watched from a distance. Because no one had ever told her she was allowed to join. The moonfruit had taken her 2 weeks to find. It didn't grow near the pack's territory. It grew deep in the ashwood, past the boundary markers, in the kind of dark that made even ranked wolves uncomfortable. Moonfruit only appeared in winter, only ripened under a full moon, and it was the one thing that could sustain a wolf's body through cold when real food was scarce. Rich in something the pack's healers called moonfire, a warmth that spread from the stomach outward, that kept the blood moving and the bones from aching and the spirit from the particular kind of despair that only deep cold could produce. The pack kept their supply locked in the storehouse. Sera was not given access to the storehouse. So she had gone to find her own. She'd spent 2 nights in the ashwood, sleeping against tree roots, tracking the faint silver glow that moonfruit gave off when it was ready. She'd crossed the boundary, which was technically forbidden for omegas without escort, a rule that existed to humiliate, not protect, because everyone knew the ashwood's dangers and everyone knew Sera had no escort to ask. She'd come back with 1 fruit. 1 small moon-silver fruit the size of her fist, cool to the touch, heavier than it looked. It smelled like winter and starlight, and something she didn't have a word for. She'd carried it home in both hands like it was a heartbeat. She'd been saving it. For tonight, the coldest night of the year. The night of long frost, the pack called it. When the temperature dropped so severely that even wolves, with all their warmth and fur and pack heat, stayed close together and burned their biggest fires. The kind of cold that didn't just chill. The kind that reached inside you and touched something vital. Sera had been planning to eat the moonfruit tonight. She'd been thinking about it for a week. And then she heard the crying. The old woman was sitting in the snow. Not collapsed. Not fallen. Sitting, deliberately, with her legs folded beneath her, as though she'd simply stopped walking and decided the ground would do. Her clothing was thin. Laughably, dangerously thin for a night like this. A gray traveling cloak that might have been worn once, perhaps decades ago, now worn to near transparency at the elbows. No gloves. No proper boots, just wrapped cloth over her feet, already soaked through. She was crying quietly. Not dramatically. Not the kind of crying that demanded attention. The kind of crying that had been going on for a long time and had run out of energy for performance. Just tears on a weathered face, disappearing into wrinkles, dripping from a sharp jaw. She was old. Extraordinarily old, it seemed, her hair the pure white of someone who had stopped pretending otherwise a long time ago, her hands when Sera drew closer showing the particular translucence of great age, the skin thin as paper over the architecture of bones beneath. But her eyes, when she looked up at Sera, were the sharpest things Sera had ever seen. Gold. Not yellow. Not amber. Gold, the deep, molten, coin-bright gold of something ancient and enormous and wildly alive. Sera stopped walking. "Child," the old woman said. Her voice was steady despite the tears, despite the shaking that was moving through her entire body from the cold. "I have lost my way. And I am so very tired." "Where are you trying to go?" Sera asked. The old woman looked at her for a moment with those impossible golden eyes. "Somewhere warm," she said. "Just that. Nothing else." Sera looked at the moonfruit in her hand. Then she looked at the old woman. The old woman's lips were beginning to blue. Her fingers, Sera could see now, were trembling so badly she likely couldn't have held anything. And there was something in her face, not just cold, not just exhaustion, but a deep, bone-level depletion that Sera recognized with uncomfortable familiarity. It was what starvation looked like. It was what Sera looked like, when she caught glimpses of herself in the river. "Don't," said the part of her built from 3 days without food and 2 weeks of careful hoping. "That fruit is the only reason you'll survive tonight. You know what happens to omegas who don't survive. Nothing. No one notices. No one grieves. You disappear and the world continues exactly as before." She crouched down in the snow. "Here," Sera said. She pressed the moonfruit into the old woman's shaking hands. The old woman went still. She looked down at the fruit. At the faint silver glow of it in the dark. Then she looked up at Sera, and something moved through those gold eyes that Sera couldn't read, something vast and complicated and very, very old. "This is a moonfruit," the old woman said, almost carefully. "These are rare. Difficult to find. I know. This was yours. You need it more." "Child," the old woman said, and her voice had changed slightly, lost something performative and gained something rawer in its place. "Do you know what you're giving away?" "Yes," Sera said simply. And then, because honesty had always been the only luxury she could afford, "I'm cold too. I haven't eaten in 3 days. I found that fruit 2 weeks ago and I've been saving it." She paused. "But you're going to die tonight if you stay out here. And I'm probably not. I'm used to the cold." The old woman was quiet for a very long moment. Then she ate the fruit. She ate it slowly, with her eyes closed, and the silver light of it briefly illuminated her face from within, a warm glow visible at her throat, her cheeks, spreading down through her chest. The shaking eased. The blueness left her lips. When she opened her eyes again, they were very bright. "What is your name?" she asked. "Sera." "And your rank?" A pause. A familiar flicker of shame. "Omega." The old woman nodded, very slowly. She looked at Sera the way people almost never looked at Sera, thoroughly, carefully, like she was something worth the time of a real examination. "Where do you live, Sera?" "The storage shed. At the edge of the territory." Another pause. "You should come inside with me. It's not warm, but it's out of the wind." The old woman let Sera help her to her feet. She was lighter than she should have been, even lighter than her age and frailty suggested, as if something essential had been burned away. But her grip on Sera's arm was, for just a moment, very strong. She stayed 3 days. 3 days in which Sera gave the old woman, who said her name was Marin, just Marin, with no family name offered, the better part of her wool sacking and the wool blanket, and slept closer to the wall where the drafts were worse. 3 days in which Marin ate whatever meager scraps Sera managed to gather, twice boiled grain, foraged roots, a piece of dried meat Sera had hidden behind a loose board against emergencies, and slowly became more solid, more present, more here in a way that hadn't been true that first night. 3 days during which Sera noticed things she tried very hard not to think about. The way Marin sometimes went quiet in the middle of a sentence, and seemed to be listening to something far away, with an expression that wasn't confusion or age, it was attention. Focused, executive attention, the kind that belonged to someone who made large decisions. The way her accent slipped occasionally into something that was not the regional inflection of any pack Sera knew, something older and more formal, and carrying within it the faint ghost of command. The way she watched Sera work. Not with the lazy observation of someone being waited upon, but with the careful, measuring attention of someone assessing. Not her labor, her choices. How she spoke. How she moved. How she handled the small cruelties that visited even during those 3 days, Corinne throwing the door open on the second night to scream at Sera for missing a water-hauling duty, not noticing or not caring that there was a guest present, the word she used for Sera specific and practiced and designed to reduce. Sera had kept her face still through it. She had said, "Yes, Beta Corinne. I'll make it up at dawn," and kept her voice empty of everything. After Corinne left, there had been a long silence. Then Marin said very quietly, "You've had a great deal of practice at that." "At what?" "Becoming invisible. Making yourself small. Not so they stop hurting you. I don't think it does that, but so the hurt lands on something that isn't quite all of you." Sera didn't answer that. After a moment, "Does it work?" she asked. "Where do you come from? Does smallness keep you safe?" "Where I come from," Marin said. "Smallness is impossible." She said it lightly. But something in the phrasing, the particular construction of it, the way she said "where I come from" rather than "in my pack" or "in my village," made the back of Sera's neck prickle. Where exactly was that? On the third morning, Marin was gone before dawn. She'd left the blanket folded neatly. Which should have been nothing, politeness, tidiness, basic courtesy. Except the blanket had been mended. The long tear at the corner had been repaired with stitches so fine and even they looked machine-made. The thread used was, and Sera held it up to the light for a long moment before she could believe it, silver. Not gray. Silver. The kind of thread that cost more than Sera had ever held in her life. Where did it come from? Marin had had nothing. No bag, no pack, no visible possessions at all. Sera sat with the blanket in her lap for a very long time. Don't think about it, she told herself. She thought about it. The rumor arrived 4 days after Marin left. Like all rumors in a pack, it moved at wolf speed, appearing everywhere simultaneously, whispered between ranked wolves in the great hall, discussed in lower voices in the stable yard, erupting in sudden, hissed arguments between the pack's senior lieutenants. The Alpha King was moving through the region. Sera heard this in fragments, because no one told her anything directly. She heard it in the pauses between orders given to her and in the scraps of conversation that continued as if she weren't present, because to many of the pack, functionally, she wasn't. His name was Calith. Alpha King Calith Ashbourne, ruler of 9 territories, commander of a war force no single pack had ever successfully challenged, a wolf who had claimed his throne at 19 by defeating his predecessor in single combat, and who had expanded his kingdom 3 times since through combinations of force and strategy that his enemies still couldn't fully reconstruct. He was, by every account available to Sera through overheard conversation, not a wolf who made courtesy calls. "Why is he coming here?" she heard one of the senior pack females hiss at another. "Nobody knows. That's what's frightening. He doesn't just pass through territories. He doesn't just visit. When the king moves, something is happening. Should we be alarmed?" A long pause. "We should be terrified." Alpha Roth, the pack's leader, called a full assembly for the following morning. Sera was not invited to the assembly. She heard about it secondhand, in pieces, later that day. What she heard made the silver stitching on her blanket suddenly feel very loud. The Alpha King had not sent word through normal diplomatic channels. He had not sent a herald, not dispatched an envoy, not communicated via the relay network of lesser pack messengers that served as the region's postal system. Instead, a single soldier had appeared at the pack's border, enormous, silent, armored in black, and delivered a folded message to the border guard with no explanation and then simply left. The message had 4 words. He is coming. Prepare. Nothing else. He. Not me. Not the king requests. Not Alpha Ashbourne will visit on such and such date. Just him. As though there was only one he in the world, and everyone already knew who he meant, and the only information worth conveying was the fact of his arrival. Sera spent that night very still in her shed, holding the mended blanket. It couldn't be, she thought. An old woman, alone, in the road, without guards, without anything. It couldn't be. But she kept thinking about the golden particular eyes. Kind of controlled panic that looked, from the outside, like intense preparation but felt, from the inside, like barely contained terror. The great hall was cleaned twice, and then cleaned again. The best stores were brought out, the aged wine, the reserve meat stocks, the fine table linens that Sera herself had washed and pressed and had never seen actually used. The ranked wolves were called in to receive instruction on protocol, how to bow, at what angle, when to speak and when not to, how to address the king's soldiers and how absolutely not to address the king himself. You do not speak to the Alpha King unless spoken to, Corinne announced to the assembled pack, her voice carrying a whetted edge of anxiety. You do not make eye contact unless invited. You do not offer opinions, information, or anything unsolicited. You keep your eyes down and your mouth shut, and you make this pack look like it deserves to exist within his kingdom. She looked around the assembly with an expression that was trying to be authority, and was actually fearful. If anyone embarrasses this pack. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Sera was not in the assembly. She was in the kitchen, preparing food for the reception, because the ranked wolves needed to practice bowing and someone still had to actually cook. She worked alone in the kitchen that had fed 200 wolves and now needed to produce something fit for a king, with no instruction on what he preferred and no one available to ask. She made what she knew how to make, the good things, the simple things, the things that required patience and care because they had no flashiness to hide behind. Slow-roasted root vegetables with herbs from her small private garden. A broth she'd been keeping as a personal reserve, rich and dark and aromatic, started 3 days ago from bones she'd salvaged. Bread baked twice, the way her mother had shown her before her mother was gone and she was alone. She worked for 6 hours. When Corinne swept through at the end and tasted everything with a critical expression and said nothing, which was, from Corinne, a form of approval, Sera allowed herself a single moment of something that wasn't quite pride but was adjacent to it. Then Corinne added, "You'll stay in the shed during the visit. The king's party doesn't need to see the pack's failures walking around in plain sight." Sera said, "Yes, beta Corinne," and went back to the shed. She sat down on the wool sacking. She held the mended blanket. She thought, golden eyes. She thought, where I come from, smallness is impossible. She thought, don't. But the thing that had started in her chest 4 days ago, the strange, terrified, impossible thing, didn't stop. She felt him before she heard him. That was the only way she could describe it. A pressure in the air, the way a storm announced itself before the clouds were visible, something changing in the atmosphere, something vast and close and moving closer, and every animal instinct Sera had ever possessed, buried under years of practiced smallness, suddenly clawed its way to the surface and screamed, "Pay attention." Then she heard the horses. Then she heard the silence. That was the most frightening thing. Not the sound of the king's party arriving, the thunder of hooves, the clatter and clank of armored soldiers, the whole impressive machinery of a royal entourage. That was loud, yes. That was impressive, yes. But then, as his party reached the pack's main gate, the entire pack went silent. 200 wolves. Not quiet, silent. The specific silence of prey when the apex predator enters the clearing. Every instinct simultaneously reaches the same conclusion and sends the same message to everybody: be still, be small, Do not draw attention, because this is something that could end you without effort. Sera, in her shed, pressed herself against the wall by instinct. She heard his voice for the first time. She couldn't make out the words, too far, too muffled by walls and distance. But she heard the quality of it, low, precise, carrying the particular resonance of someone who had never in their life needed to raise their voice to be heard, because the alternative, quieter and more deliberate, communicated something more frightening than volume. Alpha Roth's voice in response. She could hear the difference immediately. The way a river sounds different near a mountain. Minutes passed. Then she heard Corinne's voice, sharp and sudden, from somewhere outside. But she was told to stay. And another voice, someone she didn't recognize, male, carrying military precision. The Alpha King requests the presence of every member of this pack. Every member. Those are his words. A silence. She's not. Corinne started. Every. The military voice repeated. Member. She came out of the shed in her work clothes, because she had no others. She wore the wool dress that had been mended so many times it was structurally more patches than original fabric. Her boots had a crack in the left sole. Her hair was what it always was, untamed, unattended, the kind of situation that resulted from owning no mirror and having no one who cared about your appearance. Her hands were rough from work and reddened from cold, and she had a burned scar on her left wrist from the kitchen that hadn't been there a year ago. She walked toward the great hall with her eyes down. She heard the pack's silence change character as she entered the yard, becoming something charged and ugly, the particular quality of collective embarrassment pointing itself at a target. She heard Corinne somewhere to her right, a sharp exhalation that communicated volumes without words. She felt the shape of what she was in this moment, the proof of the pack's failures that had been explicitly told to stay hidden. She kept her eyes down. She walked to the back of the assembled pack and found a place at the edge and looked at the ground. Then she looked up. Because the silence changed again. He was standing at the front of the great hall, facing the assembled pack, and she searched for the word and found nothing adequate. Enormous was wrong, because it wasn't just physical, though he was that too, tall and broad-shouldered and armored in black that absorbed the firelight instead of reflecting it. Powerful was wrong, because power was everywhere in packs and this was different, something past power, something that had consumed power and gone further. Dangerous. That was closer. The kind of dangerous that was perfectly still. He had dark hair, cut close at the sides, and a face that was, not handsome, exactly. Beyond handsome. The kind of face that resulted from generations of something, though what specifically Sera couldn't name. Sharply defined, expressionless with the ease of someone who'd made a long time ago the decision that their face was not for public communication. His eyes were scanning the assembled pack. Sera looked down again before they reached her section. She heard Alpha Roth speaking, the formal welcome, the practiced words, the careful choreography of a lesser alpha addressing a greater one. She heard the king's responses, brief, precise, extracting exactly the information he wanted and nothing else. Then, I am looking for someone. The hall went very still. A woman was traveling in this territory 9 days ago. Elderly. Alone. She was caught in the cold near your eastern border during the night of long frost. Absolute silence. I want to know if anyone encountered her, sheltered her, helped her. A pause. Or harmed her. The last 2 words were said in exactly the same tone as the preceding ones. That was the most frightening part. Sera felt the cold work its way up from her feet to her chest. Don't, said every survival instinct she possessed. Don't you dare, said the part of her built from years of keeping her head down. She was just an old woman, said the rest of her. She needed help and you helped her. There's nothing wrong with that. You have nothing to be afraid of. Her hand went up. She became aware of several things simultaneously. The way the assembled pack turned to look at her, 200 wolves, moving as one, with an expression she'd never seen before, a kind of horrified collective recognition that she didn't yet understand. The way Corinne's face went a specific shade of gray. The way Alpha Roth's eyes snapped to her face with an emotion that read, unmistakably, as no. And the way the Alpha King's gaze, crossing the entire length of the great hall, found her. Found her and stopped. She could feel it physically, the weight of that attention, The specific quality of those eyes now focused on her. Dark eyes, she saw from this distance. Not golden. Dark. But with something in them that she recognized in the way you recognized the shape of a room you'd only visited once, years ago. "Come forward," he said. She walked to the front of the hall. She was aware of the sound her cracked boot sole made on the stone floor. She was aware of the state of her dress, her hands, her hair. She was aware, with excruciating precision, of everything that she was and wasn't, measured against every eye in that room. She stopped at a respectful distance. "You encountered the woman I described?" he asked. "Ah, yes." Her voice was steady. She was obscurely proud of that. "I found her on the road near the eastern tree line. She was sitting in the snow. It was very cold." "What did you do?" "I gave her a breath. I gave her a moonfruit I had. And I brought her to where I sleep. She stayed 3 days. She left the morning of the 4th day, before I woke." Silence. "What is your name?" "Sera." Keep your eyes down." Old instinct. "No." She kept them up. "I'm the Pax Omega." She heard something move through the assembled pack behind her, not quite sound, more like a collective shift, the physical manifestation of a collective oh no. The Alpha King was looking at her with that expression she couldn't quite read. He turned his head slightly and spoke to someone beside him. She couldn't hear what he said. The soldier to his right nodded and moved toward a covered cart at the side of the hall that Sera hadn't noticed before. The cover came off. And the woman sitting beneath it, wrapped in furs now warm, solid, present, was Marin. Her eyes, as they found Sera, were gold and very bright and not at all surprised. Sera's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "My mother," the Alpha King said quietly, "left the palace 11 months ago. She does this periodically. She calls it checking the temperature of the kingdom." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite anger, and wasn't quite grief, and was deeply, privately, real. "She means she goes looking for people who will be kind to her without knowing who she is. She says rank reveals nothing. That the truest measure of anyone is what they do when no one important is watching." He looked at Sera. He looked at her for a long time. "She was nearly dead when she reached you." "I know," Sera said. "That's why." She stopped. Started again. "That's why I gave her the fruit. Because she needed it. You were starving yourself." It wasn't a question. He'd clearly already been told. By Marin, maybe. By the intelligence his soldiers had gathered before he arrived, maybe. By simply looking at her, the dress, the hands, the particular quality of someone who had been running on insufficient fuel for a very long time. "I was hungry," Sera said. "She was dying. There wasn't really a choice." Another silence. From behind her, she heard Corin make a sound, small, controlled, quickly suppressed. But she heard it. Then Marin spoke. From across the room, wrapped in her furs, her golden eyes steady on Sera. "She gave me the only warmth she had. She slept against the wall so I could have the blanket. She told me she was starving and gave me the food anyway." A pause. "And when the Pax Beta came to scream at her, she said yes and sorry with her eyes absolutely empty of fear. Not because she wasn't afraid. Because she has been surviving this for so long that the fear is just background noise." Marin looked at her son. "She is why I left the palace," she said. "To find someone like this. To be sure they still existed." Calith, the Alpha King, turned. He turned to face the assembled pack, and something in the movement of that turn made every wolf in the room take a half-step back without consciously deciding to. The expressionlessness of his face resolved into something more specific. Something precise and cold and very, very deliberate. "Alpha Roth," he said. Roth stepped forward. His face was the color of old ash. "My king! Your Pax Omega fed my mother when she was dying of cold." Not a question. Not even inflection. Simply stated, simply devastating. "She gave her the last food she had. She sheltered her for 3 days. Pause. While your Omega was living in a storage shed. Wearing a dress that has been mended more times than I can count. Having not eaten in 3 days." Roth opened his mouth. "Don't," the king said softly. Roth closed his mouth. Your pack has been systematically starving one of its members and housing her in conditions unsuitable for an animal, while benefiting from her labor. Each sentence landed with the measured, even quality of a judge reading charges. That member saved the life of the only person in this world I would wage war over. He let that sit for exactly long enough. Beta Corinne. From somewhere behind Sera, Corinne's footsteps approached. Stopped. You are responsible for the allocation of resources within this pack. Yes, my king. Her voice had lost everything that had been in it for years. Every edge, every satisfaction, every practiced cruelty. What was left was just fear, unadorned. Everything you withheld from her, the king said. You withheld from my mother's guardian. Everything you denied her, you denied the woman who saved the life of my mother. A pause. I want you to think about that very carefully. The silence in the great hall was total. I'm going to be generous, the Alpha King said, in a tone that made the word generous sound like the narrowest possible mercy. I'm not going to destroy this pack today. Because my mother asked me not to. Because she said the Omega herself would not want that. Sera's throat was very tight. But here is what is going to happen. He turned back to Sera. You are leaving. It was not a command. Or, it was, in the technical sense. He was the Alpha King and his words were law. But the way he said it was not the way commands sounded in her experience. It sounded like something else. Like the way you told someone who'd been standing in the cold for a very long time that there was somewhere warm, just inside, just here, if they wanted it. The palace has extensive grounds, he said. There is a position available for someone who, according to my mother, makes a broth that's worth traveling 50 miles for. A breath of startled sound moved through the assembled pack. Sera barely heard it. She was looking at Marin. Marin was looking back at her with those gold eyes, warm now, fully warm, and something in them that Sera didn't quite know how to receive because it was something she hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time. It was simple recognition. I see you. I saw you. You were worth seeing. You can say no, the king said. He meant it. She could hear that he meant it. Somehow that was the most undoing thing. Her voice caught. She made it behave. I have very little to pack. Something crossed his face, fast, gone before she could fully identify it. Not quite a smile. Something that acknowledged what she'd said on multiple levels simultaneously. My soldiers can wait, he said. She packed in 12 minutes. The mended blanket. The small collection of herbs from her garden, wrapped in cloth. A knife she'd made herself by reshaping a broken one. 3 smooth river stones she'd kept for years for no reason she could articulate except that they'd felt like hers in a world where very little did. She stood in the shed doorway with everything she owned in a bundle the size of a loaf of bread. Corinne was waiting outside. Sera had expected this. She'd had 12 minutes to prepare her face for it. Corinne looked at the bundle. At the shed. At Sera in her patched dress, about to leave for a palace. Her expression cycled through several things very quickly. Disbelief, rage, something that was not quite shame, but was in the same neighborhood. You were always... She started. I know what you were going to say, Sera said. Corinne stopped. You were going to say I was always nothing. That I never mattered. That this is some kind of accident or mistake and I haven't earned this. She held Corinne's gaze, steadily, without heat, without the carefully learned emptiness she'd deployed for years. Just her own actual eyes, looking back. You can think that if you want. I don't need you not to. She walked past her. She didn't look back. Marin was waiting at the edge of the yard, leaning on a walking stick one of the soldiers had found for her, wrapped in her furs, her white hair loose in the winter light. She looked entirely herself, not frail, not ancient, but inhabited by something large and old and deeply at rest. She held out her hand when Sera approached. Sera took it. How did you know? Sera asked. That I wouldn't just keep walking? When you were on the road? I didn't, Marin said. That was rather the point. Her golden eyes crinkled at the corners. But I hoped. Sera thought about that. The thread, she said. The silver thread. A small gift, Marin said. It seemed inadequate at the time. It still seems inadequate. It was perfect, Sera said. It mended something I thought it was perfect. Marin's hand squeezed hers. They walked toward the king's party together. The palace, she would learn, was nothing like what she'd imagined. It was large, yes. Indecently, almost offensively large after the shed. The kitchens alone were bigger than the entire iron-veiled Great Hall. The bed she was given, hers, specifically hers, in a room with a door that locked from the inside with a key that was given to her and no one else, had a blanket on it that was softer than anything she'd ever touched. She kept her mended blanket on top of it. The palace staff were not warm to her at first. She was a stranger, an Omega from a provincial pack, brought in under circumstances that generated a great deal of whispered speculation. She was not mistreated. No one in the Alpha King's palace mistreated anyone, because everyone there had seen what happened when certain lines were crossed and no one wanted to find out where the other lines were. But she was not welcomed. She did what she knew how to do. She worked. She got up early and she learned the kitchen, the stores, the rhythms of the palace's enormous, complex domestic machinery. She made herself useful in the specific way that came naturally to her, quietly, consistently, without demanding acknowledgement for it. She helped where help was needed and she stayed out of situations that weren't her business, and she was kind to the people who were new and uncertain because she knew exactly what that felt like. Marin visited the kitchens most mornings. She would sit at the worktable and drink tea and talk to Sera while Sera cooked, and slowly, over weeks, their conversation expanded from the small and immediate to the larger and more complex. About packs and history and what it meant to survive, and what it meant to be seen, and whether it was possible to become, late in life, something different from what you'd always been. You're not late, Marin told her once. You're 23. I feel older. That's the shed talking. Give it time. The king. She saw him in the palace in the way you saw weather, present, significant, occasionally alarming, affecting the environment in ways you adapted to. He was busy. He was always busy. The business of 9 territories and a war force and diplomatic relationships complex enough to make a cartographer weep was not a small thing. But he knew where the kitchens were. She noticed that he started appearing at odd hours. Not conspicuously, not in ways that seemed deliberate. He was getting water, or he had a question for the head cook, or he was passing through. He was always passing through. He passed through with an implausible frequency for a king who had several hundred rooms available to him. He also ate the things she made. Specifically. Not the elaborate formal dishes from the head cook, presented at proper mealtimes. The things she made in the in-between hours. He had eaten 3 full bowls of her broth on separate occasions. He had, once, eaten the entire batch of twice-baked bread she'd made as a test batch and left it empty on the counter with no explanation. She started making more of it. She left it where he tended to appear. They were going somewhere, she and this terrifying, complicated, impossible man who had looked at her across a great hall and found her immediately, and who watched her now with that same quality of attention, like she was worth the time of a real examination, and who had, once, when she had dropped an entire tray of dishes and stood amid the wreckage waiting for the consequence, simply said, "Are you hurt?" Not the dishes. Her. "Are you hurt?" She didn't know yet what shape the thing between them would take. She knew she wasn't afraid. She knew she had a room with a door that locked and a key that was hers and a window that showed a garden and a blanket with silver thread that she'd carried here from a shed at the edge of a territory that never saw what she was. She knew that Marin was 3 corridors away and always had tea ready. She knew that she had found, at 23, sitting in the cold of a freezing night with her last fruit in her hand and a stranger in the road, something she hadn't known to look for. Not safe, exactly. Not rescue. Something quieter and more durable than either. The beginning of a place that was hers. In the end, 1 fruit. 1 freezing night. 1 girl who chose to stay when every survival instinct told her to keep walking. That's all it takes sometimes. To change everything. If this story broke your heart, if you felt every cold night, every empty bowl, every moment she said yes, when she should have screamed, then subscribe. Because the next story? The next Omega they underestimated didn't wait for a king to save her. She burned the whole pack down herself. And you do not want to miss it.